for me, right, Web3, what really brought me to the space was wanting to create this open, verifiable, composable web, where we can have lots of different kinds of applications and users are in control and it's interoperable. You can switch applications and we're building this global verifiable graph. But I'm really excited about how that could transform how developers build dApps and how we realize this vision of Web3.
Oh, let's definitely expand on this. All right, here we are with Yaniv Tal, founder of The Graph, one of Web3's major indexing protocols and standards. The Graph has been called the Google of Web3. And so it's great to have Yaniv here on the Defiant podcast. Welcome.
Hey, Camilla, thanks for having me.
Of course. Okay, so before we get into all the latest developments on what's coming for The Graph, I'd love to get the backstory on both yourself, like your background, how you got into crypto, and what led you to start The Graph.
Yeah, so I started getting into Ethereum and Web3 in 2017. And before that, I was doing a startup working on developer tools. And I've been thinking about just how to help more people tell the computers what to do, how to build beautiful products, the future of coordination. I had done a few startups myself. And I started seeing the issues with this like centralization, right, of companies and all the big Web2 companies that started locking their users in and it started making the products all like crappy. And I wanted to help solve those problems as well as like bigger societal problems that to me always felt like issues of like centralization and how we distribute power and those types of things. So I got really just in love with Ethereum in 2017. And that's when we started building in the space. We tried to build the dApp ourselves, realized that you couldn't really build a decentralized application. And that's when we started working on The Graph.
Was the reason that you thought you couldn't build a dApp because there wasn't really access to data, or?
Yeah, that's right. We built our smart contracts and then we tried to build the front end. And right there, it was hard to get the data from the chain in the format that you wanted. And you'd basically have to write code that you'd have to run yourself. And we saw that as being like a point of centralization. Because if you're running that code yourself, actually a lot of the logic happens in the processing, right? So much actually of software is building views on things. So something happens on chain, something takes place in the world, and then you build up a view on what that means to you. And so it's actually really important logic. And so we thought it was really important that that part was also decentralized.
Okay. So then you built The Graph as a solution for that. And so how does that work?
Yeah, so The Graph is a decentralized indexing network. It's a network for organizing and querying Web3 data. And developers build Subgraphs. That was the first type of indexing data service that we created for The Graph. And that can be deployed on a decentralized network where you have indexers that will run those subgraphs. And what those subgraphs do is they watch for events and things that are happening on chain, and they process that and they index it so that it's efficient to query. And so subgraphs have become a core part of the Web3 stack. There's thousands and thousands of projects that use subgraphs for their dApps in production. And then since then, we've also expanded the Graph network to have new types of data services. So there's a streaming indexing technology called Firehose and Substreams. And we've continued to kind of work on that layer of the stack above the chain for enabling like powerful Web3 applications. So
can you explain more about how these subgraphs work and how you incentivize developers to build them?
Yeah, so we actually haven't really incentivized developers to build subgraphs because it's solving a real need that they have. And so they just kind of pick for the tool, right? They need to build their applications. They're looking around, what's the best tool that I can use? And a lot of them choose subgraphs. It's a piece of code. You write it in a version of like TypeScript, and it lets you just transform and process the data and fit it into a structure that you want. And so the data that goes on chain, it tends to be very like low level. You have to like save space because right, storage on a blockchain is expensive. And so you can think of that as like raw data. And then what the subgraph does is it lets you decode that into like a structure. So you can define a schema, and that schema gives you the structure for the information that you want, right? So you can say, oh, this thing is actually a token, this thing is actually, a DEX, this is a pool, this is a marketplace, whatever those different things are, and you can structure it however you want. And so I think of subgraphs now as being kind of a transformation from raw data to structured information. And that's been really useful to a lot of developers. Okay,
so the graph provides the raw data. And how do you do that? So the graph provides raw data that's fetched by developers that then create subgraphs and kind of organize that raw data in something that they can use. But how is kind of that raw data stored and fetched, and how is that process?
So the original node software that powers subgraphs is called Graph Node. Mm-hmm. And there's one main implementation of that right now written in Rust. And it uses Postgres as a data store, and then GraphQL as a query language. So GraphQL is a popular, query language from Facebook. And I think that's been a big part of making Subgraph super successful, because people love querying data with GraphQL.
Okay. And so is that Graph Node, how decentralized is it? Is it stored by a bunch of validators, or is it just by the graph itself? How do you ensure censorship resistance, decentralization, all the different things that you would want as a blockchain developer?
Yeah, so there's hundreds of different indexers, and anyone can run an indexer, and they run one of these nodes, and they connect to a network where they can get paid for doing that indexing work and for serving queries. So the graph developed a micropayments solution now called Graph Tally, and that allows clients to stream micropayments for query fees, and that creates incentives for the indexers. So, just like you have validators or, that are running nodes on different blockchains and networks, folks that have DevOps experience, so like to run servers, can run these indexers. And just, there's plenty of people out there with database experience that like to optimize things. So there's some really talented folks in the indexer community that are running these indexers.
Oh, cool. How many indexers are there in the Graph network?
It's somewhere in the 200 range.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so there's this network of 200 indexers who are storing this raw data, right, from blockchains. And then developers then query that data on subgraphs, and they organize it, and then they use it for their dApps. So that's kind of the basic architecture.
Cool. Yeah, that's right.
For these indexers, are they doing this for any blockchain? How many networks or how many chains do you support now?
Oh, good question. I have lost count. It feels like there's a new chain every week. It might be in the 90 range, something like that. So lots of different layer ones, lots of different layer twos. On Ethereum, on Solana, we actually do have substream powered subgraphs, I believe, now also on the network. But basically, it's pretty easy to add support for new networks. There's new networks and layer twos coming out all the time. And so there's a chain integration process that the community can use if somebody wants a new network to be supported on the network. They go through that process, and that can get done. And then it's really up to the indexers to choose which networks they want to support. So, a lot of these folks are participating in these different networks. So if they're on, some specific chain, it's easier for them to also just run an indexer because they already have all of that node data locally.
Great. And do you have an idea of how many dApps and protocols are making subgraphs and using the protocol?
Good question. I mean, it's in the tens of thousands. And yeah, I've lost count, but there's quite a few.
Nice. Can you expand a bit on how your token plays a part in this ecosystem?
Yeah, so GRT is a work token. It's staked by the indexers and it's staked by delegators who want to provision work to those indexers and to help secure the network. And then it's also signaled on subgraphs by these curators and then paid as query fees by the consumers to the indexers.
Cool. I know that crypto is really volatile and there are many different factors that go into the price of the token. But are there any changes that you're anticipating or planning for GRT Tokenomics?
There are a lot of interesting discussions that are happening on ways to evolve the protocol. The network was launched over 4 years ago, which is crazy. So we have like more data and I think like learnings about how to run like an infrastructure network or, like how these things function in production than I think, a lot of protocols. But we've been slow to make changes in a sense because there's so many moving parts and there's so many different participants and, to kind of change a business under them is kind of a thing. So we like to be slow and methodical, but there's a proposal, all of our governance happens through a governance forum and there are these GIPs, proposals that people submit. And there was one, I believe is GIP 70 on evolving the graph protocol economics that provided some really interesting ideas about some ways that, we can, direct issuance for even more productive things in the network. Right now a lot of the issuance goes to the indexers, which is great because it helps to incentivize and bootstrap early networks. But as more of the indexer revenue can come from query fees and from these new indexer payments that we're introducing, where like developers or anyone can pay indexers directly for doing the indexing work. So that kind of frees up some of the issuance that can be used for kind of other purposes to help build out capacity and to help, create a network that is providing like lots and lots of value to lots and lots of users.
And that's related to something else I wanted to ask you, which is, in all these years building the graph, what have you learned are the main challenges in terms of blockchain data? Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot. So, to me, I think we still haven't fully realized the vision of Web3. And, I've been working on, trying to help build Web3 for 7.5 years. But I still don't see, what I kind of came here to build yet, and so we've been working on the pieces. And what I found is that it comes down to the primitives, how we build these applications and how we organize knowledge and information. And so recently we released a new standard called GRC 20. And I'm going to be talking about it today. And it's a new knowledge graph standard. And so what I've realized is beyond just, the way that we've been building applications on the blockchain today, how we actually structure the information is really important to make it composable, right? So for me, right, Web3, what really brought me to the space was wanting to create this open, verifiable, composable web, where we can have lots of different kinds of applications and users are in control and it's interoperable. You can switch applications and we're building this global verifiable graph. And I think that hasn't happened yet because we haven't quite gotten the right primitives. And so it's early days with this new standard. We just, announced it and folks are starting to play with it. And it's at that cool bleeding edge phase of these types of technologies. But I'm really excited about how that could transform how developers build dApps and how we realize this vision of Web3.
Oh, let's definitely expand on this. So, first follow-up question is, I'd love to kind of hear more about where you think Web3 is lacking. in kind of this initial vision that you had?
It really comes down to the composability, right? So we have decentralized networks, and I think like we know like there's a lot of Web3 infrastructure now, right? Like when the graph first launched, it was arguably the first Web3 infrastructure protocol, right? You had like blockchains, and then we were like the first thing like that, one of them, maybe us and like LivePeer, that like was decentralized but wasn't a blockchain. And so we have open networks, and we have pretty good versions of like verifiability, like low-level verifiability, right? So you can, do a proof, and you can see that the data hasn't been tampered with. But what we don't have, is composability. So, most of the success so far, I think, has been in DeFi. And that's because with DeFi, most of the information lives on chain. But to build like rich applications, to me, like Web3, it's gonna be any kind of application, right? Like you name it, like eventually, like we won't be using Web2 apps anymore, right? Because they're siloed. And why would you use an application where there's a company that owns all your data and they control everything and they make the rules? And so eventually when we get the primitives right, like there will be new Web3 apps to do everything, and it'll all compose together. And so I think it's the composability that's the part that's been missing so far.
Okay, because I definitely do see composability in DeFi. And that's, I think it's what makes Web3 exciting and so different relative to Web2. Just like seeing how, DAI can plug into Aave and become collateral, and then you can borrow some, like another like ETH, and then use ETH on Uniswap, and just like you can plug in like these different pieces to like just like do things very seamlessly.
Exactly.
But you're right that outside of DeFi, you don't really get that in, I don't know, like there's maybe social fi is another kind of area in Web3 that's kind of more developed, but like, yeah, you get like these like separate dApps, like there was Friendtech, there's Farcaster, but they do feel more siloed.
They're still siloed, exactly.
Yeah.
So we haven't gotten that interoperability and composability of information, right? And that's really where GRC 20 comes in. So I mean, for example, events like we're here at ETH Denver, and your people are going to all these events and parties and things, and almost everyone's using like Lumia, right? It's like it's a beautiful app, but it's a siloed application, right? Can I just build my own front end if I want to just see talks on ZK, or if I want to specifically look for panels or see what new was announced at these talks. Like if the information was composable, if you had a way to structure all of that information, you could even ask an LLM a question and get an answer back because it has all of the knowledge well organized, or you could build your own custom front ends, and people could build customized applications for different use cases, right? Maybe the app you use for a party isn't necessarily the app you want to use for a conference, right? Because a conference is much, bigger, there's different stages. So that's the kind of thing that when we get like the primitives right and we enable composability, like that's the promise of Web3, is to have that interoperability. You can have lots of different applications. It's not one size fits all, but it all works together. And that's what I want to see us get to.
Very cool. Okay, so how does GRC 20 try to solve this problem? Like what does it do specifically?
Yeah, so GRC 20 is a new standard for knowledge graphs. And the core insight behind knowledge graphs is that you don't want the information to be too rigid. So most of our information systems are rigid. They have a fixed structure. And knowledge doesn't work that way, right? Like knowledge, if you think about how your own mind works when you're learning something, it's all about like creating connections between things, right? You're like, oh, this is related to that. oh, like this thing is like that other thing I heard about. Like all of these free-form connections, you don't even know what the structure is going to be ahead of time. And that's what creates a higher level of understanding. It's also the thing that allows applications to customize things, right? Where you can kind of reuse, shared information, but you can customize it and do it in a way that that other applications can also interact with. So essentially what GRC 20 is it's a way of representing information as flexible composable knowledge. You have entities, so anything can be an entity, like a person is an entity, a place is an entity, and these entities have globally unique IDs. Okay. And so if we're referring to someone, if I want to refer to Camilla, there should be an ID that represents Camilla, and in another application, that ID would represent her. Now, on Ethereum, we have that for people already, right? You're like, oh, that's my ETH address. Mm-hmm. Well, what about a place, right? What about Denver? Like, what's the ID for Denver? Like right now, every application would use a different ID, and then that creates the composability issue, right? Or like, what are the fields about the city of Denver that are important? Maybe in an event app, just the fact that there's a city called Denver, but for other apps, maybe you want the population, or maybe you want the geo coordinates, or maybe you want and so every app has different data that it cares about, and if you have the right primitives for describing all of that, you can enable applications that are actually like composable. Interesting.
Okay, so how do you go about creating an ID for every single thing?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, it's that's the process we're getting started with. So we recently announced GeoGenesis, which is a knowledge graph app. You can think of it a little bit like Web3 Notion, a little bit in the user interface. It's also kind of a browser. There's nothing really like it, so it's an interesting piece of software. But with this, we give people tools to organize any kind of knowledge and information. So just with better tools, people can better organize knowledge and information. And also we're working on a set of tools to allow developers to integrate this stuff into their own apps. So essentially, you give people tools to coordinate and to organize knowledge and to form into communities where you can get to consensus on more and more shared knowledge. And somewhere in there is the answer.
Okay. So there's an app that it will get developers to include information about like all these different identities or like entities.
Entities, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah. So you can define the types. Mm-hmm. You can add properties to those types. You do it in the context of spaces. So a space is like a community. So you can create a community for anything. So these could be public spaces. You could have a public space for the city of Denver. You could have a public space for the crypto industry. You can have a personal space for yourself. You can have a space that you control for your company. So these are all spaces, and each space has its own knowledge graph, mm-hmm. And rules for updating that knowledge graph. Okay. And so, if we talk about like sharing IDs for things, that's where governance can really come in handy, and it gets to this kind of foundational question of like, how do you know what is true? And you may have your truth, and someone else has their truth. And as communities, right now, where do we go to be a Schelling point that represents kind of our shared truth? Mm-hmm. And to me, that's like a foundational thing that we need in society. And the fact that we don't have that, I think, causes a lot of issues. I think, it's people don't know what they can trust anymore. Mm-hmm. right? And I think so all of that, it's about having the right tools to organize knowledge and then get communities to consensus and help giving communities tools to get to consensus on those things.
And so why would a developer go and spend time in like adding all this information to this app? Or is it like, do they do it because they're doing it as part of like building their own app that they're adding this information, or like what's kind of the process?
Yeah, that's right. I think so. It's a combination of to solve their own problems, right? Like you use apps every day and you put information into those apps because you're trying to solve a problem. But then, you might not want that to just be trapped inside of a single app. So if you put it into a knowledge graph, then that allows you to access that same information from other apps. So that gives you more power, more flexibility, freedom, portability. So that would be a reason to use something like this.
Can you give me like a concrete example on like how this information is recorded?
Yeah, so the knowledge itself is structured using, that's what the GRC 20 standard is for, is how that knowledge is structured. And then it's uploaded onto a network like IPFS and then anchored on chain. Okay. So you can actually use this stuff privately. And we're working on tools to enable developers to build applications like that. But when the information is going to be public, then you want to publish that on a blockchain. And so you can anchor it on chain.
Okay. But so like let's use the Lumi app as an example. Like if Lumi wanted to start creating their own knowledge graphs for like events in different cities, would they create an ID for each city and then that would be stored on chain somehow?
Yeah, well, you could publish as much knowledge as you want in a single transaction. So you could upload, here are my 1,000 cities that I care about. Here's all the information I care about for all of those cities. And then you publish one transaction on chain, and now that's on, now there's global consensus on the fact that you publish those cities.
Okay, and then if there's like another app that also wants to use like city names and locations, how would they know that this information already exists on chain, and how would they integrate it to their own app?
Well, that's where the indexing comes in, all right? So that's like indexing is such a core part of the stack, and that's really why we started with indexing. So with the proper indexing, you should be able to search and query and find everything that's already there, and then use what you want or customize, if you want things to be different for your application or your use case.
Okay. And all of this, will this now be a part of kind of the original graph protocol?
Yeah, so we are working on exactly that. And we're building in public, and as a community, yeah, we're integrating all of this stuff together.
Nice, very cool. Yeah, I mean, sounds like a really ambitious goal and kind of vision, but it seems like it's definitely needed to like just make things more composable and connect all these different on-chain applications. So yeah, excited to see how it develops.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, we've been at this for like 7.5 years, and I think we're getting really close. So my hope is, there's so many people in the Web3 ecosystem that have been building amazing tools, right? Wallets, privacy, solutions, all these different things, governance systems. I didn't mention, but we're working with Aragon on the governance for these spaces. And I'm just so excited to see all these Web3 pieces snapping together and getting to a point where, we can make all of the change that we want to make in the world. I think we're really close.
Right now, AI is becoming a part of like basically, everything we interact with. Has it changed how you work, how the graph works at all? Are you integrating AI in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. we've been like, early adopters of AI, and data is obviously, a key component of AI. And so I think, AI is going to be useful for this in, two ways. The one that people are most familiar with is as a way to kind of query and interact with information. So being able to ask an AI model and a question and have that answered against index data that's been indexed on the graph. So there's already, some experiments doing those sorts of things. And we want to get those deployed on the network so that indexers can run that stuff as well. And AI can also be used to like organize knowledge and information, and using agents to automate a lot of that work. So there's a lot of interesting things that people are doing in the ecosystem.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, like you said, it just feels like for a data focused protocol, like AI should be just like a really kind of great enabler to do what you need to do. And then another important piece of data is obviously privacy. And that's always been kind of an issue with blockchains being public. So how are you thinking about privacy and maybe allowing users the option to have their data be private in some way? I know it's like a huge challenge, but how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think that's going to be important. Absolutely. I think, a lot of people, when they think of Web3, they do think about owning your data and they want that privacy. And so I think we need to give just developers, the tools they need to build like full applications. And sometimes those applications use public information and sometimes it's private. So we are working on things in that area. I don't have anything to share now, but in general, I think it does tie to how do we structure knowledge and information, and how do we give developers the best tools to build their applications. And so we focus a lot on developer experience, right? With subgraphs, with Firehose substreams. More things on the indexing side, and now also more things like higher up the stack to enable those types of applications.
Very cool. So looking forward, you already talked about knowledge graph is a major kind of focus. What other milestones are you working towards in the next few months?
Yeah, I think there's going to be really exciting improvements to the indexing stack. So we're always thinking about how to make developers' lives better, how to make indexing faster, more modular. And so some really exciting work that's being done there. The stuff that's happening with the economics. So people can always jump into the forum to kind of see the state of the discussion there. I think it's always interesting when you can improve incentives to incentivize public goods or, things that help create value for the network participants. So those are some of the things I'm excited about.
Very cool. Okay, and then wrapping up, I know you talked about kind of your vision for what Web3 should be. So I'd love to end kind of on that note. Where do you want us to go as an industry, and what role do you want the graph to play in that?
Yeah, well, I do think the next big stage is going to be making Web3 real. I think DeFi has been amazing, and we now have all of these primitives and building blocks, and it's such a valuable tool. But it's really going to get to use when we integrate that with all kinds of real world applications, right? And we have people doing things, the tools that they, use to do their work every day, the tools that we use to coordinate. To me, I think a combination of, I love the stuff that's happening with public goods. And if we look at things like what's happening with government efficiency, I think that's interesting, bringing transparency to how we're spending public funding, to help make sure that we can coordinate in larger and larger groups to achieve shared goals. So I think there's things in that direction that will be, really transformative, as well as just, how we coordinate and live our lives and play and in our like personal lives. So I think across the board, when we have the primitives right for Web3, I want to see developers building amazing apps that help people do things better, but just in a composable way. And then I want to see us like use that stuff to like transform the world.
Amazing. Cool, Yaniv, thank you so much for sharing. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so great chatting with you. Thanks for having me.
Of course.